Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Imperial Navy was designed primarily for engaging in the occupation and subjugation of planets. At the end of the Clone Wars, the remaining separatist holdouts in the galaxy were testing grounds for new Imperial strategies and weapons, which eventually led to the Imperial Navy that we all know and love during the Galactic Civil War. The Empire had many deadly and fearsome options for taking a planet and controlling an entire system, but there's really nothing more terrifying than a massive barrage of turbo-laser fire from an Imperial Class Star Destroyer just hanging in low orbit. In a lot of ways, the sight of an ISD over any battlefield essentially destroyed the morale of opposing ground forces, because no matter how many waves of Imperial Army troopers or stormtroopers you stop, there's really nothing that can save you from this type of bombardment. Even if you do manage to dig down into the ground and create an elaborate tunnel system, that'll only just piss off the Imperial Navy even more, and lead to the naval code Base Delta Zero, which is a type of orbital bombardment that is so devastating that its goal is to literally melt the planet's upper crust into molten slag. Now, the Imperial Navy's ability to reduce the surface of a planet into molten slag was not like a hidden secret of any kind. The naval code Base Delta Zero was actually first introduced by the Galactic Republic, which might be surprising, but let's be honest, the Republic and the Empire weren't all that different, and there is a very thin line between a democracy, a republic, versus a authoritarian state. So one needs to be vigilant. But anyway, this was a strategy designed by the JAR to root out deeply entrenched separatist forces in the last years of the Clone Wars. And later on, during the Galactic Empire's reign in 18 BBY, Imperial forces used Base Delta Zero on one of their own medical facilities on the planet of Cetron after the Advanced Science Division lost control of an aggressive plant species known as the Slithervine. The Imperial Navy claims that they only use Base Delta Zero for planetary liberation or extreme cases like with the medical base that we just talked about, but it's very clear that they could use it for other purposes, like destroying enemies or dissidents. And I think a lot of individuals, especially senators who didn't trust the Empire, knew that Base Delta Zero could be very quickly turned around against our home planets. As horrifying as turbo-laser onslaughts might seem, though, there's one particularly effective countermeasure that could stop a Base Delta Zero situation, and that is a planetary shield, which is simply a deflector shield that is powered by a much larger generator and can basically stop turbo-laser fire, and usually these shields can expand over an entire region of a planet, or the entire planet in certain cases. When you have a generator that is planet-based, you really can scale it up to really large sizes, and so you'll have enough power to stop most fleets. Some good examples of planetary shields were the one used by the Rebel base on Hoth that was just a regional shield, whereas others covered an entire planet or moon, like the one that the Empire set up over the Endor moon and on Scarif. Some more pacifist planets like Alderaan and Naboo depended on planetary shields to help them maintain that pacifism. Planetary shields were able to withstand almost continuous bombardment from turbo-laser batteries. Some are actually built to withstand collision from large asteroids and other celestial bodies. And I think in a lot of ways, Alderaan's blatant harboring of insurgents and stockpiling of illegal munitions was probably spurred on by this kind of arrogance and confidence they had in their planetary shield. They probably believed that even if the Empire came to enforce their laws against all the Alderaanians, they couldn't get through that shield. But they were kind of wrong. You see, the Empire saw such planetary shields as a great threat to their grasp on power, and so this was actually one of the primary reasons why the Death Star program was started. Yes, it was designed to force the galaxy to obey the Emperor through fear, but testing the weapon on Alderaan had a much more practical purpose. Up until this point, knocking out a planetary shield was pretty much impossible. But against the Death Star super laser, even Alderaan's extremely powerful shield buckled in just a tenth of a second after it was struck by the massive laser beam. But we all know that the Death Star was impractical. It was insanely expensive to build. It took more than a decade to complete. It also involved concentrating a huge percentage of the Empire's resources, credits, and manpower on one platform, which is never a great idea. The Empire lost basically 1 million of their finest officers with the destruction of that first Death Star at Yavin. Plus, the Death Star is a hammer. It breaks up entire planets without much effort, which isn't always ideal if you're trying to occupy a planet because there's valuable resources or manpower there that you need to preserve. I mean, it's one thing to send a message with the destruction of Alderaan, but how many habitable and valuable planets can you destroy before you start running out of planets to govern over? It's just not a viable tactic in the long run to destroy planets. Now, the Death Star's power could be controlled and turned down, but even at a lower setting, which is a single reactor ignition, this laser can easily penetrate the crust of a planet and crack it open, sending debris and molten lava spewing into the atmosphere, oftentimes significantly changing the environment and oftentimes making the planet habitable. I mean, if you take a look at some of the photos of what Jeddah looked like after a single ignition reactor firing, you'll know what I mean. The planet isn't really destroyed completely, but it's also not somewhere you'd want to live. What the Empire really needed was a weapon that was a fraction of its power and a lot easier to control, and cheaper to build. They needed a weapon that could make planetary shields obsolete, but at the same time not cause any more than local damage. And actually, the Republic had a program that was designed to do exactly that. During the Outer Rim sieges in the late Clone Wars, you had these separatist fortress worlds that were extremely hard to penetrate. The Onager Class Star Destroyer was famously underpowered when it came to its turbolaser complement, and it was impossible to fly through planetary shields with dropships. Although you technically could walk through a shield if you could land ground forces somehow outside of a more regional, shield. It became very apparent that the Republic Navy needed something with a lot more firepower than the standard Venator, or even the Victory Class Star Destroyer, which was one of the earlier Republic-era models focused more on orbital bombardment. Thus entered the Onager Class Star Destroyer, specifically built as a siege-breaking vessel. At 1,288 meters in length, these ships were a bit smaller than the Imperial Class Star Destroyer and a bit longer than the older Venator class. But where the Venator's hangar door ran across the entire top of the ship, you have the Onager's massive siege-breaking weapons. There are two variations for the Onager Class Star Destroyer. You have the super heavy composite beam turbolaser, and then you have the orbital bombardment particle cannon. The super heavy composite beam turbolaser is a scaled-up version of what the Republic's self-propelled heavy artillery walker used on Geonosis against the CIS Lucrehulk core ships, and the orbital bombardment particle cannon is a mass driver, aka a massive railgun like the one found on the ATTE but scaled up. Both of these weapons used a scaled-down version of the Kyber crystal technology that powered the super laser on the Death Star. This was an extremely powerful weapon that gave the Empire the ability to cut through even the most fortified enemy positions and even the largest planetary shields. This was a huge game changer, and in my opinion proved to be a much larger threat than the Death Star ever was. If you think about it, the Death Star was basically discovered and then subsequently destroyed in short order. This was supposed to be a weapon of fear, and how can you fear a weapon if you didn't know existed? The Rebellion never even had enough time to alter their strategy to adjust to this new death weapon. The biggest effect that the Death Star actually could have was altering rebel behavior, to make it suicidal for them to establish a permanent base, which of course would prevent them from growing into the conventional force they eventually became. The Rebel Alliance had very strict protocols for hiding the location of their bases, but ultimately if you have a headquarter or central command, you're going to have regular shipments and travel to that location, which makes it easier to discover. I mean, Tarkin managed to find the Rebel base on Yavin 4 because he placed a tracker on the Millennium Falcon, and the ISB used an even crazier Dragnet strategy with 100,000 Viper probe droids sent to every system, with hundreds of ISB officers monitoring the feeds for potential hidden bases. That's how they found Echo Base on Hoth. After the near destruction of the Rebel base on Yavin 4, the Rebel Alliance came up with protocols for quick evacuations for any one of their bases, including their headquarter bases, which is how the Rebels managed to extract most of their forces from Echo Base on Hoth when the Empire arrived. But a big part of that success was due to the planetary shield over Hoth, which forced the Empire to land ground forces and assault the base on foot. When you have something like the Onager Class Star Destroyer, you basically negate the effects of that shield. It used to take an entire fleet of ISDs several hours to bring down even the weakest planetary shields like the Rebels used on Chopper Base. The Onager Class Star Destroyer could output enough firepower to destroy such a planetary shield in just a few shots. If that Star Destroyer was at Hoth, then Vader's Death Squadron could have pummeled the Rebel base's evacuation fleet from the air while it was still on the ground, and the Rebels would have suffered much heavier losses. The widespread use of the Onager Class Star Destroyer would have made the Rebel fleet a lot more mobile and unable to set down permanent routes. This would of course hurt their overall effectiveness as a force, and in many ways limit their tactical and strategic capabilities. It should be noted that the main armament on an Onager Class Star Destroyer was not only extremely powerful, but it also was very long range in its effectiveness. Traditional turbolasers, as we see during the Resistance's evacuation to Dakar, have a limited range, and the energy of their rounds seem to dissipate over long distances. Also, atmosphere of any kind typically bleeds a lot of energy from any type of turbolaser round. And so for an ISD to properly engage ground targets, they usually need to get into low orbit for maximum effectiveness. The Onager Class Star Destroyer does not suffer from that same problem. In certain configurations, they could basically snipe a planet from very far, like the edges of a system, while hidden in, let's say, an asteroid cloud. This gives rebel forces on the ground almost zero warning before their defenses are compromised and completely destroyed. If you take a look at Onagers equipped with the orbital bombardment particle cannons, they were extremely deadly because these things were basically mass drivers that fired slugs, physical slugs, and these things do not bleed energy in the same way that balls of plasma will when they encounter atmosphere or they're flying over long distances in vacuum. If anything, once they hit the gravity well, they speed up. The Onager was also quite useful in fleet engagements, especially in the latter years of the Galactic Civil War when the Rebel fleet was able to challenge the Empire in more conventional style battles. In this case, you're typically going to be using Onagers that are equipped with the super heavy composite particle turbolasers. They're much faster at acquiring targets and hitting them. You're not firing a projectile in this case, but just a beam of light that just destroys everything in its path. These weapons could pretty much destroy most Rebel capital ships on contact, sort of like the second Death Star firing upon the Rebel fleet at Endor. The Onager Class Star Destroyer is what a lot of Imperial Navy fans asked for. The weaponization of the Kyber crystal by Galen Erso was a significant breakthrough for the Empire. It just wasn't properly used. First of all, the Kyber crystal's amplification abilities could have created clean and cheap energy for the masses, which in my opinion would have created far more loyal worlds and loyal citizens than a fleet of Imperial Class Star Destroyers or super lasers ever would. If you build up the economy, people typically are happy. But instead, the Empire tried to turn the technology into a very destructive weapon. The super laser was a very effective weapon, but the Death Star program was ultimately way too large and a drain on resources. Reminiscent of the stupid super weapons created by the meth-addled Nazis at the end of World War II. The Onager was a more practical use of this technology and a far more efficient one. This was the game changer the Empire really needed, and it probably would have made the Tarkin Doctrine a lot more feasible. Because there really isn't a big difference between a super laser that can destroy an entire city or portion of the world versus a super laser that can destroy an entire planet. In both cases, people on the ground are going to die. You don't really need to make them more dead by destroying the planet that they happen to be on. Such line of thinking can only come from the type of mental illness that extremely evil people succumb to when they get hit in the face too much by dark side energy. Only a handful of Onager Class Star Destroyers were ultimately produced. Their production, like all other Imperial weapons, like the TIE Defender, were limited by the Death Star program's extreme costs. Had the Death Star not been created at such an exorbitant cost, I think they could have created an Onager Star Destroyer for every sector fleet, maybe even more than that. The Onager Class Star Destroyer only cost around 376.5 billion credits, or 2 to 3 times the cost of the standard Imperial Class Star Destroyer. After the appearance of the Death Star, Rebel intelligence basically theorized that the Empire could have created at least 1,000 ships with a miniaturized version of this super laser, and they were terrified of this. Such a fleet could have kept the rebellion from ever growing into a proper conventional force and challenging the Empire. Ultimately, the Onager Class Star Destroyer was never deployed in large enough numbers to affect the outcome of the war. The Rebel Alliance only uncovered like 4 of these ships throughout the entire conflict. It should be noted that the Onager Class Star Destroyer was constantly being refined throughout the war, so there was a lot of attention being placed on the ship, just it wasn't being produced in large numbers. It should also be noted that there were some significant weaknesses with this type of weapon. The Onager Class Star Destroyer was extremely valuable and needed an entire fleet for protection. Like many specialized types of Star Destroyers, the Onager lacked defensive and offensive capabilities other than its main weapons. The Onager had only 5 main sublight engines, making it relatively slow. It did have a Class 1.75 hyperdrive, which made it slightly faster than the standard Class 2 hyperdrive used by the ISD. Their entire ship was powered by a massive solar ionization reactor, and from its silhouette it could easily be identified by its crossbow-like front with 2 long prongs extending in a T-shape. While the ship was controlled by a command tower similar to other ISDs at the rear of the ship and at an elevated height, it also featured a lot of engineering stations where basically constant maintenance was being done to the large central weapons. The Onager also had extremely long-range sensor arrays and targeting computers for that main weapon. This is why, despite being much smaller than the ISD, the Onager Class Star Destroyer had a huge crew of around 25,200 members. For additional defenses, the ship also had 25 heavy turbo laser batteries, 6 twin heavy turbo laser batteries, and 20-point defense laser cannons, along with 36 TIE fighters. Ideally, the Onager never had to use these weapons because it could destroy enemy fleets before it even got close to it. The Onager Class Star Destroyer would have been a game changer in most major conflicts in the Galactic Civil War had it been present. Had the Imperial Navy been led by a more rational group of individuals with more combat experience, I think this ship would have been deployed as a regular part of the Imperial Navy. The Onager's legacy would be continued with the First Order's Minotaur IV class siege dreadnought, which proved to be quite devastating during the evacuation of Dakar, forcing the Resistance to quickly pack up operations and flee. But once again, the First Order fell into the trap of making the ship way too large and resource intensive. At almost 8 kilometers long, the Minotaur IV class siege dreadnought featured a whole lot of surface space that needed to be protected and just provided a huge target for enemy forces to hit. So there you have it, guys. That is our coverage of the Onager Class Star Destroyer. Another missed opportunity by the Empire. Again, you know, the Imperial Navy had a lot of great ideas. They just had poor leadership. They were not good at putting resources in the right programs. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.